I live in a simple 5-story building in Moscow, in apartment number 47. Next door to me, naturally, is an apartment with a slightly crooked yellow sign with the number 48 on the door. It is this apartment that I will be talking about. And no, anticipating your questions, as far as I know, no one has ever died in this apartment in its 40-year history. The people who lived there did not complain of strange noises or visions, or that the chairs slid across the floor by themselves. By all accounts, it is an average one-room apartment with all the amenities, an ideal home for single young and not so young people. In fact, even among the local residents, it does not have a bad reputation. There have never been any stories or legends about it being a bad apartment. Come to think of it, I'm probably the first and only person who noticed that something was wrong with apartment number 48. And that's only because I live right next door. I've lived in this building for 28 years, and during that time, the apartment has had 6 tenants. Considering that the apartment has been rented out since Soviet times, that's not so many, but the circumstances under which each of the tenants was evicted were remarkable. When I first moved into apartment 47, the apartment next door was occupied by a respectable-looking pensioner with glasses, a typical Soviet intellectual. As was customary for an educated person of that era, he subscribed to a pile of newspapers and magazines, and I often met him on the stairs when he was going down to the mailbox. We would greet each other and sometimes exchange a few words about the weather and football matches. We were both avid Spartak fans. About 2 years later, I noticed that the flow of correspondence for the pensioner had begun to dwindle. No more thick magazines and specialized publications, only Pravda and Izvestia, which were practically mandatory for every self-respecting citizen. Then the postman stopped delivering even those, and the mailbox of apartment 48 was empty. During the period when Pravda was still being delivered, I sometimes saw my neighbor in the stairwell, and his appearance clearly indicated that he was in poor health. Well, he was at an advanced age, and you know what our healthcare system is like, so I could only feel sorry for him. Then I stopped seeing him. It seemed that the pensioner didn't even go out to the store for groceries or take out the trash. 5 years after I moved in, he finally left for somewhere, according to rumors, to the countryside, and the last time I saw him leaving, he made a painful impression on me. Sunken gray cheeks, dull eyes, completely white hair and tufts, trembling hands, a dystrophic build. He was just a pale shadow of the plump, energetic old man I had met 5 years earlier. After he left, the apartment stood empty for a couple of months. Then a young worker moved in. I didn't manage to establish much contact with him. The young man was always in a hurry and kept to himself, leaving early in the morning and returning late at night. That was at first. A couple of years passed, and he began to spend much more time inside his apartment. Some people whispered that he had done something serious at work and had been fired. It gradually became clear that the former worker was heavily addicted to alcohol. When I occasionally saw him in the stairwell or near the house, he always had a shopping bag in his hand, either with a large can of beer or a bottle of Russian vodka. I wondered where he got the money to drink regularly and pay his rent when he hardly ever left the apartment. Like any rapidly deteriorating alcoholic, the guy's appearance was changing for the worse. Dirty, wrinkled clothes, constant alcohol on his breath, sickly thinness, dark circles under his eyes, puffy skin. In 5 years, he aged literally a quarter of a century. Then he died. He got into a fight at night while waiting in line for another bottle of booze, and someone stabbed him. The next tenant was a middle-aged man. He was notable for driving a huge black SUV with tinted windows. It was the mid-1990s, and such a vehicle clearly indicated the caste to which its owner belonged. I can't say anything definite about him. Apparently, he ran some kind of market stall, of which there were many in the city at the time, ended up in the hospital after a fight with some gangsters, and brought women of easy virtue to his place. I had my own serious problems at the time, and didn't pay much attention to my neighbors' lives. But during the 5 years that the businessman lived in apartment 48, he also melted away like a matchstick. At the end of his stay there, the rosy-cheeked young man with the bulldog gaze turned into a trembling old man who could barely hobble up the steps, his thin hair falling from his head with every step. Of course, one could blame his stressful profession and the consequences of those very hospitals. But after the new Russian disappeared without a trace, unfortunately, I don't know the exact circumstances, the apartment was vacant for only a short time. This time it was a woman with a child of about 5 years old. They said she was an accountant. She went to work during the day and left the child alone. Apparently she didn't have enough money for kindergarten, or the waiting list was long, as usual. And what do you think? 2 years later, when it was time for the child to go to school, she quit her job and started staying at home, refusing to let the child go to school. Social services visited her, but she made such a scene that I could hear everything through the wall in my apartment. They came back several times, but in the end, they seemed to give up. At least the child never went to first grade. The rest of the time, when the woman was left alone, everything was quiet in the apartment. The child didn't cry, the mother didn't drink, and she didn't bring men home. This went on for several years. Then, one day when I was away, it was summer, I was on vacation in the South, the neighbors heard loud crying and called the police. They broke down the door and found the woman lying unconscious in a hot bath. She had suffered an ischemic stroke. I was told later that she was resuscitated, but she had been without medical attention for too long and never fully recovered. In short, she became bedridden. I don't know what happened to the child, whether he was sent to an orphanage or whether relatives were found who agreed to adopt him, but Fyodor Andreevich from apartment 45 told me that Galina, the woman herself, looked like a living corpse, and it couldn't be attributed to a stroke. Waxy skin, a flabby face, some kind of sores on her hands and neck, weighing a maximum of 40 kilos. It was after this fourth tenant and Andrei's colorful story that something clicked in my head. The sequence of events formed a gruesome series, and I decided to keep a close eye on what was going on in apartment 48. The fifth was another lonely pensioner. However, that was where his resemblance to the quiet, polite intellectual from the 80s ended. He was a bitter, hunched old man of small stature, constantly muttering to himself and glaring at anyone who crossed his path with his sparkling eyes. He didn't seem to be entirely Russian, but rather of some Eastern European descent. But that wasn't important. The old man was hard of hearing and turned the TV up full blast in the evenings, which kept me awake and annoyed me terribly. In response to any complaints, he would burst into a shrill cawing, saying that he would complain here and there that they were hurting an old sick man and violating his rights. In short, my neighbor was unpleasant, and as I watched him rapidly decline over the next 4 years, I didn't feel much pity for him. During this time, he became unable to move without a cane, went completely bald, lost half his teeth, and became practically blind. In fact, it was his blindness that led to him being taken to a nursing home. The old man could no longer take care of himself. When they carried him out, he cursed loudly and damned the whole world, starting with the orderlies and ending with his ungrateful relatives, who had decided to kill him by sending him to rot in a nursing home. The last resident to date has been living in the apartment for almost 4 years. She is a young female student who came from somewhere in the countryside and successfully enrolled in a university. But I can no longer vouch for whether she is still enrolled there. When I first saw her, fresh, beautiful, just taking her first steps into adulthood, my heart sank. Plucking up my courage, I knocked on her door one evening and told her everything I knew about the apartment she was living in and advised her to look for another place to live. However, this young creature apparently took me for a crazy old man and just laughed. No, of course, she promised to do something, but only to get rid of me. In reality, she still lives there. The only thing she stopped doing was going to school. And again, the question arises, how does she pay the rent? And who owns this strange apartment? In all my 28 years, I have never seen the landlord. Tenants moved in and out of the apartment on their own. The other day, before the May holidays, I saw my neighbor on the staircase. A rare occasion, I must say. She practically disappeared from view 6 months ago. She looked terrible. Her face was gaunt, her cheekbones were sharp, her eyes were bulging, and red veins were visible in them. During our brief conversation, I could clearly hear her teeth chattering. She reminded me of a drug addict. Who knows, maybe she really had become one. "Are you okay?" I asked. "Yes, everything's fine." she replied nervously, trying to walk past me. You look terrible. Do you remember what I told you a few years ago about your apartment? I remember. She looked at me with such undisguised malice, as if I had insulted her terribly. Are you going to let me pass? I'm sorry, I stepped aside. Still, you'd better move out before it's too late. She took a couple of steps toward her apartment, then stopped and turned around when she heard my words. Her face resembled a skeleton. I like it there, she said. There's no reason to move out. You have no idea how good it is. After that, she went to the door of her apartment, fumbled with the lock, jangling her keys, then went inside, slammed the door shut, and moved the iron bolt from the other side. I stared blankly at the crooked yellow sign with the number 48 for a few seconds, then sighed and went to my place.